we're very happy to welcome Dr. James Delgado. As a maritime archaeologist who works around the globe, James has spent decades in the fascinating world of underwater exploration. From diving in the shallows to supervising some of the most cutting-edge modern expeditions that have spanned the 7 seas, Jim is known as a respected and passionate leader whose prime directive is helping keep maritime archaeology alive and accessible to everyone. He has worked on some of the most famous shipwreck sites in history, from the Titanic, the lost fleet of Kublai Khan, the USS Arizona, the fabled ghost ship Mary Celeste, the atomic-bombed fleet at Bikini Atoll, and his expeditions have solved long-lasting undersea mysteries, brought closure to families, and connected the modern world with powerful human stories from the past. During his 46-year career, he has been privileged to host the popular television show The Sea Hunters for 5 years. He was executive director of the Vancouver Maritime Museum for 15 years and was the executive director and then president of the Institute of Nautical Archaeology from 2006 to 2010, before beginning his tenure as director of the Maritime Heritage Program for the United States National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Office of the National Marine Sanctuaries from 2010 to 2017. I don't know how you said that every day. In May of 2017, Jim became Senior Vice President of Search Incorporated, where he continues to bring more history and archaeology alive for scholars and the public alike. When an amazing discovery is made in the ocean, if Jim is not there, he is asked about it by the world's media. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Dr. James Delgado.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming tonight. It's always a pleasure to be able to get out from behind a desk or even off the deck of a ship and come and share some of the work that colleagues and I are privileged to be able to do as we have scoured those 7 seas, both on the surface and below, but also to connect with communities, because so much of the work that we do as archaeologists in looking at the past is really understanding the past as it relates to people. I may study ships, but the purpose of this work has been and always is people. And to that end, there's not a place I've gone where I haven't met somebody who's had a connection to the sea. And in some cases, those are profound connections because somebody served in time of war or in time of peace wearing our country's uniform. Somebody had somebody in their family who served and who could not come home. Others have worked in the merchant marine, and of course you're right here next to a very important port that has done so much for not only our country's economy, but also in reminding anyone who would take a look at that, the importance of ships and shipping to this day. So I love it. I absolutely love it. One point of, it's not correction, it's breaking news in a way, but the fun kind of breaking news. I retired 3 months ago, so this is what retirement looks like. So, as my wife says, though, she said, "That's retirement, sailor, isn't it?" And I said, "Yes, ma'am, it is." Because I'm still actively working on projects. I just don't have to go to an office anymore. Did that show? Did that? Okay. So, with that, thank you, and allow me to share some thoughts and a few of the sites that I've been privileged to work on. I want to start, though, with a key point, and obviously I'm not going to read this. The point is, you can read it. What I want to say is the story behind those words. We actually don't know how many shipwrecks there are out there. If you go all the way back to human history, first off, let's just say this. Probably the first thing that people built, other than fire and something to hunt with, was something to cross the water in. And what we suspect now, based on evidence, and we're not finding boats from that far back, but what we're finding are clear evidence of people being in one part of the globe and getting to another part of the globe, and they had to sail, and they did so 80,000 years ago. we find this going all the way on through later history with these connections. We have used the ocean as a highway. It is the means by which we as a species spread across the globe. And in that, it has become the most powerful driver of global economies. It has been our largest battlefield. It is our biggest graveyard, but it is also, to this day, still the source of over 90% of the world's food. And with that, and I know for some of you living here on the shores of the Gulf understand this, the number one grouping of shipwrecks in the world are vessels engaged in harvesting the sea. They, like the Navy and the Coasties and others, they have to go out, but they don't always necessarily get to come home. And so a number of the wrecks that we've been able to work on have involved fishing vessels. One of those expeditions, not here, was to try to find the Andrea Gale. We did that for those families. That, of course, is the fishing boat made famous in both the book and the movie, The Perfect Storm. And it stood, I think, for many as a reminder with that one highly publicized case of just what it means for families who have seen that. I'm going to talk tonight about families who have served, who have also seen that same cost of being at sea. But millions of these vessels down there. And to that end, what I've always liked to say is that I think it's our greatest museum. With all due respect to this and to so many others, every time I say this and I'm someplace like the Met or the Louvre, they get irritated. But it is truly the largest museum in the sea, and I'd be remiss because the publisher said they'd kick me if I didn't. That's the title of the new book, The Great Museum of the Sea, which just came out, in which I really wanted to talk about and share my thoughts after being at this for 5 decades of why that counts. But in this book, why we as people care about ships and shipwrecks. So what's made my field change dramatically has been the same type of technology that has changed the rest of the world. Robotics and all sorts of different types of technology have enabled us now to go into areas I never thought possible. Consider this, though. When I started in this field 46 years ago, the area of the oceans that we knew, we had charted, that we knew the bottom, what it looked like, less than 10%. That's it. I mean, so, of course, you can go and look at the Nat Geo maps and you can see ridges and mountains. We know that there's the Marianas Trench. How do we know that? Because satellites bounce off the surface of the ocean, and the way gravity affects it gives you a sense of there's a mountain, there's a big hole. That's it. Or occasionally, in the shallows, we've done that, but that's the edge of the bathtub. The deeper stuff we're just beginning to get to, and right now there's an initiative that the world is engaging in for a variety of reasons to better understand what's down there. And at this point, the goal was by 2030 to have mapped it all. We're at about 35%. So just for comparison, we've mapped the moon more than once at 100%. We've mapped Mars to 100%. We're mapping all sorts of other things. The oceans, we're getting there. What's exciting is that every time we go and we look at these things, we find something new. And with that, it's just, well, I just come back to it, retirement. So with that, I think you begin to understand, here's the passion, here's the interest, and the day doesn't go by when I don't stop and not just think about the projects that have been done, but the projects yet to come. I've been privileged to work on a number of projects in and around the world. Just very quickly, proof, as my daughter said, that Dad was once young. Diving and excavating a Phoenician shipwreck off the coast of Spain. And what am I excavating there at that moment? A 2,600-year-old bag of pistachios. A Civil War submarine built in New York that went to Panama to harvest pearls and was abandoned on an island that we discovered by chance. Diving with colleagues on an aircraft carrier wreck off the coast of California. And most recently, holding a piece of wood from a Spanish galleon which crashed ashore with only 30 survivors on the coast of Oregon in 1693. It broke apart and its timbers were scattered. It's still part of the lore and legend of that coast. I was just up there doing work on it and recovering some of the pieces of the galleon which had washed into a sea cave that we were able to pull out. If that sounds familiar, this story inspired Steven Spielberg to make a certain movie, The Goonies. So you never know what you get called in to do. Let's talk about a couple of the wrecks. Titanic is the one that people always ask the most about. I've been privileged to go to Titanic a few times, and for a while, particularly in my government career, I was the lead US government official responsible for Titanic. Responsible for Titanic doesn't really mean much. You get to go talk to congressional folks, you talk to other people, you try to encourage different missions. We were there to do mapping, and I'll talk a bit more about that. But to that end, my first visit to Titanic was 25 years ago, and this is us getting ready to do it the old way, which was not just with the robotics going down. Titanic's 12,468 feet deep. That's 2.5 miles. So to get there, robotic vehicles can do it, and then ultimately submersibles. Dr. Ballard, Bob went out with Alvin in 1986. The Soviets, later Russians, went out after that. The French went out in their submersibles. And here I am with the Russians in 2000, getting ready to dive off of the Academic Mstislav Keldysh, which is the same ship that, and that's the first hint, by the way, that I got the 5 a.m. flight to Houston. The same ship that features in Jim Cameron's Titanic, along with the Mir submersibles, Mir 1 and Mir 2. Mir meaning peace in Russian. So with these, you lock into these subs. You have to go through that hatch. Once you get inside, you're in a 6-foot diameter steel sphere with 2 other people who are either going to be your very best friends or your worst enemies by the time this is done. You cram in, and then they close that, and they lock the hatch. And you're like, why are you locking the hatch? In case you panic. I couldn't open that hatch anyway with 6,000 pounds of pressure. Just the same. I said, well, what happens if anybody does? He said, well, and I like this fact, that the Russians always have a pretty simple solution. Don't forget that after we had NASA design the pen that could write upside down in space, the Russians brought pencils. He said, I said, how do you calm people down? He took a big wrench out. It gets even better, and I'll just leave it at this. I said, by the way, when you dive in these things, you're locked in that for about 24 hours. So there's a questionnaire you have to fill out. I guess you know what one of those questions is. So with that, I said, so what if? And he goes, for this we have mission range extender. And he handed me an empty plastic bottle. Said, fortunately, nobody ever wants to use those. And if you do, you're the most unpopular person, because for the rest of the dive, sub is very close to resembling the atmosphere of a gas station bathroom. Just saying. Moving on, we locked into there, and down we dropped into that darkness that is the deep North Atlantic. These are some photos that I took back then. This is the bow of Titanic, covered with bacterial growth that's been eating the metal. Titanica halimoni is a bacteria we didn't even know existed. It's a new life form that was discovered only when we got down into the deep. And as it eats, it excretes the byproducts, the minerals of the metal that it eats, and that forms those rusticles. And the minerals come out in the oranges and the reds and yellows. And it just literally streams off Titanic. I remember coming up in the sub, looking through the port, and it's very cold. You're wearing a fireproof suit, by the way, because you're breathing pure oxygen, like they did in the Apollo capsules. But because of the Apollo problem, the Apollo 1 problem, you have a fireproof suit that you wear. It's Nomex, but it is not, it's not warm. So you've got thick socks on, you're lying there with 2 other people in what's roughly the equivalent of a queen-size bed, with curves for 24 hours. And you're cramped and you're tired, but then all of that goes away. The moment after spiraling down, it takes 2.5 hours, by the way, to fall, to get to Titanic. And when you get close to the bottom, they drop a weight and hover for a second, and you set down into that mud. And then the sonar pings, and we picked up the side of the hull and moved forward. And suddenly there it was, 3 times higher, it seemed, than this wall. Still painted black in spots, but with crusts and pustules and streams of all of that moving down. And then ports with the glass still in them. For a second, I did this because as we came up to it and lit it, and I looked in a port, I could see a face looking back. It was my own reflection. But just the same, you do go. So do I know why Jim Cameron put Dead Jack in that? You betcha. No. That's the sense you sort of get. So as you move along, what I think strikes you the most is even though the change has happened, it's as if it's a story we know. Titanic is such a well-known story. It's the most popular shipwreck of all time. It's the greatest media disaster of our time. And it's been the subject not only of so many books and documentaries, but also films. Whether you're a fan of Jim's movie or the old 1958 A Night to Remember, or Clifton Webb and Barbara Stanwyck in Titanic in 1955, it's a ship we know. And in many ways, Titanic is not a ship that necessarily left us. It's a ship that we never left alone. So with that, as you move along, because of all of that, you know these spots. So the bow, where nobody did stand and do this. But that's the foremast, and what you see is the little manhole, and that's where the crow's nest was, and that's where Frederick Fleet and his mate were standing on that cold night, when suddenly he looked, rang the bell, picked up the phone, and when the bridge said, "What did you see?" "Iceberg, right ahead!" That's the spot where he was. The bell is now gone. It was ultimately recovered and it's in a museum, but there it is. And then the long promenade deck stretching past those cabins in the first class area. So much more of Titanic, and as you move, you see it all. We ultimately went back in 2010, and at this time with Armis Titanic, the company that's been recovering artifacts, with a number of other agencies, everything paid for by CBS News, actually, $5 million. And what we used were the new robotic vehicles. These are 2 autonomous underwater vehicles. AUVs are, we had these as a classified asset in the Navy. Declassified, these robots actually can go down to depths. They carry a suite of instrumentation, so they can take video and still photos. They sonar map, and they've gotten so good now that you get resolution that is this close. And in the most recent ones, you're actually doing photorealistic mapping of these sites. These 2 drop down. They could work for about 12 hours, and they come back and you recover them. The beauty of it is, for anybody that's ever had a teenager, if they surface and you're not there to pick them up, they call you, which was good. The other part of this, though, was that these craft, when they came aboard, you recharge the batteries and download them, and we could start processing the data. The 2 worked in tandem, and just you can tell that the whole group was of an age. The Wade Institute for Ocean Discovery that had these had named them Ginger and Marianne. So that's me on the mission as we're plotting. I was the chief scientist and co-director of the project. This is what we mapped just with the sonar. So what you see here is the bow section of Titanic plowed into the mud. That abyssal mud has been down there for thousands of years, probably over 10,000 years. What you see is the distortion and the displacement as the hull hit it and plowed into it, but also shocked it in a way that drove some of the water out for a second, and then it settled back down. The geological story here is amazing. This is probably, by the way, the most studied piece of seabed on the planet because everybody wants to go to Titanic. But you can see the forward hatch up close to the bow, the fallen mast. Then moving back, the mast has come down and it's right over where the bridge was. And then past the wireless cabin up to the main decks, you can see the holes where the stacks were when they fell, and then aft where she tore apart and broke. This is the stern, which is in very bad shape. That's the last piece of Titanic to leave the surface, and we think it just plunged down hard, and it's in worse shape because it hadn't completely flooded. So it imploded about 500 feet down. And with that, that's probably where the majority of the people that were left, not just on the deck, but down below were. Because a number of the third-class passengers had been locked in by the crew and were still there. That's because that didn't flood, because the doors were closed. That's probably one reason why it looks so bad, is it ruptured. It's a pretty amazing sight to see. This is the first detailed mapping we did of it, and I didn't want to show all of the images because that could be a few hours, but with that, what we also did is we then took a variety of images using robotic cameras and stitched them together. This is just one of those, and these were the first complete photographic representations of the wreck of Titanic. Previously, it had been paintings done by Ken Marshall and others that powerfully captured the ship, or in a couple of other cases, what we were looking at were a few pictures here or there, like you just saw through that keyhole that I had photographed. But there you have it. These were published by National Geographic. What you can see is that hull, the bow dug in and flexed and broken. You can see as it did that it buckled the hull and tore a hole in there. When I came up close to it and we looked inside, that's the mail room, and there's still bags marked Royal Mail stacked in there, which was pretty amazing to see. But you also get, you see that the hull is still painted up forward. You see the black of the hull with the green moving back there and some of the white topping, and the railings were still there. In many ways, it took Titanic a while to begin to deteriorate, and it's deteriorated more since we did this in 2010. But it was an amazing game changer for us and really gave us a sense not only of Titanic, but of what the technology was doing. And the 15 years since have been absolutely amazing. But for me, the story of Titanic is not just the ship, nor is it the technology. Walter Lord, who wrote the book A Night to Remember, famously said that Titanic was a small town that died that night. And of those 1,500 or more folks, several hundred, 705 lived. The others died. And some of them were recovered. Over 300 of them were found floating, but others were not. And so when we're down there, what you're seeing is what you think you're seeing. We didn't used to show these, but I think that as time went on, we felt that it was important to do so, particularly in the aftermath of parties on the high seas and lots of last nights of the Titanic dinner parties on cruise ships, but also what happened most recently with the Ocean Gate disaster. And just for the record, I knew those people. And I was actually part of the response when that sub went missing. We actually knew that it had imploded, but public demand was such that a lot of time and effort was put in just to make sure. But shoes are basically what's left. But what's also left is baggage. And there what we see, there's a bag that's fallen open with somebody's shoe in it, but there's another suitcase. And in that, probably one of the most powerful things that does speak to these people is that luggage, not just the first-class luggage or the second-class luggage, but in some cases, these are suitcases that belong to people who were hoping to sail past the Statue of Liberty and stop at Ellis Island and become Americans. And that dream for them ended that night. So with that, yes, we often do think of them and are reminded that Titanic was very much a human tragedy. But with that, I'll also say this, that even if you're a cynical scientist, there's times in which you come to these spots where suddenly you are drawn to a place and you suddenly say, I know where I am. And for me, it was coming up to this davit in the sub. I took this picture, and that's the davit for Lifeboat 8. Lifeboat 8, as it was being loaded, Second Officer Lightoller was in charge of it. The order was women and children first. Lightoller interpreted it as women and children only. And so with that, Mrs. Ida Strauss is in the boat with her maid and others. Mr. Strauss is standing by. Now, they're a well-known couple. They're famous. They've helped found Macy's department store. They've been together for a very long time. And she's crying because she doesn't want to leave Isidore behind. But he steps back, and finally the officer says, Mr. Strauss, I don't think anyone would object if men of your age got in. And Strauss said, no, if the other men are not going, I cannot go, and I will not go. And for those men who did get into boats, there was always a bit of a stain there for them. This was a different time. And so he didn't. So with that, he stepped away, and Mrs. Strauss got out of the boat. And the officer asked her to get back in, and she said, you don't understand. I love this man. We've been together for all these years, and where he goes, I go. And they walked off together, and they died together. And for me, of course, it's a story. But it ceases to be a story when there you are, looking at that spot. I could clearly look down. The davit is still strung. The decking was still intact. I could practically, in my mind's eye, see exactly. The stage was empty. The actors were gone. But there it was. And for that moment, and it's not the first time I would do this on a shipwreck, and it's not the first, it was the first time on Titanic. This is when you cry a little bit, because as many of us have, if you've ever loved and lost, you understand what happened here. So for me, that in many ways was Titanic. So with that, moving on, I've been able to work on a variety of ships. Many of them have been warships, but in particular, at times, there are wrecks that you would like to see, like to find, that because they're historic, they have a certain appeal. You want to see what happened, what's the story after. And in this case, having worked for a number of years with my colleagues out at Pearl Harbor, diving on USS Arizona, working elsewhere in Pearl Harbor, and actually helping inter the cremains of guys who had survived December 7th to be buried again with their shipmates. There were some of these ships that were there that had meaning for me, and one of those was Nevada. Nevada was a battleship tied right up behind Arizona. And on that morning, as Arizona and all the other battleships came under attack, Nevada was hit. She took a torpedo in the side from a bomber. She took a couple dive bomb hits. Most of the senior officers were away, but the junior officers were on board, and the one set of boilers were lit up. So they decided to just go for it. Nevada was the only battleship on that morning to get underway. With a hole in the side, as one guy said, as big as a barn door. And the Japanese saw that, and they went for her. She was strafed. She got hit again with bombs, but she kept going until finally getting close to where she was going to block the channel. Those boys just drove her up onto the beach and settled her down. A number of the crew died that day. This is the Navy tug Hoga putting out some of those fires. Nevada survived, though. Arizona, of course, did not. Other battleships, Oklahoma did not, and West Virginia. But others were patched up and put back into service. But Nevada was one of the first, because that ship was too tough to die. That too tough to die followed Nevada throughout the rest of her career. Repaired and brought back into service, she served in the Atlantic and lobbed shells at the Germans on D-Day and took a hit from a German shore gun. She then went into the Pacific for the landings and got hit by a kamikaze, but she kept going. At the end of the war in 1946, she was then selected to be the target ship, the one that they painted international orange, the same color as the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, with a big strobe light on top so that the Army Air Corps could drop an atomic bomb on her. At Bikini, when we were testing the weapon in July of 1946 in the aftermath of World War II to see if a Navy could survive in atomic war. She shrugged off the atomic bomb as well. So by now, the ship really has a reputation. She was irradiated because that test scorched her a bit, but the second test was a big underwater explosion that coated the entire fleet with radioactive steam and fallout. So too hot to basically be used again, she was towed back to Pearl Harbor. And in 1948, the Navy took her out back to sea to finally sink her, as they did with most of the other target ships that were still too hot to handle. Needless to say, she didn't die easy. They thought they'd be done in a day. It took 5 days to sink this ship. They shelled her. They shelled her with the battleship Iowa with 16-inch guns. They had dive bombed her. They torpedoed her. And finally, on day 5, she gave up the ghost and went down. I'd always wanted to find her, but she was more than 100 miles off Pearl Harbor and about 15,000 feet down. So there we were. But then it's the start of the pandemic, and I'm sitting in my office in Florida. And these guys call from Ocean Infinity, and they're a international firm. They've got an office here in Texas, and the CEO here in America is a Navy admiral. And they said, hey, Jim, we've got our ship in at Pearl right now. Is there anything you'd like to go find? Yeah. But the timing was important. The pandemic was just on. It was a couple weeks in. And they said, why do you want to find this one? I said, for a good reason. I said, we have no idea what we're about to face, but there's already some panic out there, and we don't know what the course of this will be. But what I'm seeing right now draws me back to the kind of thing that I tried to do when I was in the government, and that was to use history as a means by which we could look at the past and maybe draw some inspiration from it. I said, if we think we're down and out, we're not. This is the United States of America. We've been through a lot worse. I'll tell you what, let's go find the Nevada. Let's use that as a reminder. This ship too tough to die and finally on the bottom, let's go find her. So they went out with these vehicles, and these, again, they're robotic vehicles like the others. Down they went. We had Navy logs that said she was sunk more or less here. And I said, look, I've got a box that's 100 miles. Is that okay? And it's 15,000 feet down. They found it in 8 hours. And there she is. There's the sonar. Took a beating. She's upside down. That's just a piece of the hull. The bow and the stern were shot off. Superstructure was shot off. And there's a debris field all around the hull of the battleship. But there she was, and as we did this and brought it back, there's the stern with her battleship number right there. 140, that's the frame number, because they wanted to see what the bomb would do. So every frame or rib, they had painted numbers so they could precisely focus where damage had happened. But there it was unmistakably Nevada, and talk about preservation. This is one of the best parts too. How many of you are actually, who served? Anybody here in Navy? Okay, so one of the things that's always fun is when you work with younger colleagues who have not had some of that experience. And so they said, wow, where are we? What are we looking at? And I said, well, that's a stores room, and it's about this deck. And they go, how do you know that? Well, because there's an engraving on the side that the Navy has. It's a system that tells you exactly where you are on the ship. For guys like you that come on board and know nothing. And there she is at the end, in extremis. Too tough to die. This story went national and international. And I think it helped in its own way. But it was also a reminder. And I also thought again of one of the great heroes that I got to know well, and that was Captain Don Ross, who was one of those officers that day. Captain Ross, later Admiral Ross, got the Congressional Medal of Honor for those actions. And Don's ashes were scattered at sea over this. I knew that man well. So, with that, other stories, sometimes we just get called, and not just in the sea, but elsewhere. And this is a story that's been out in the news quite a bit, and I thought I would share it just because it's a story that speaks again to one aspect of history, but also community. And it happened because out in Mobile, Alabama, on the Mobile River, which is sometimes salty depending on the tide, the story, of course, had been around of a group of folks from Africa who had been brought over just before the start of the Civil War on a schooner named the Clotilda. Clotilda was the last ship, as far as we know, to come from Africa with people prior to the Civil War. The story had been passed down. The ship itself had been scuttled or burned. Where exactly, nobody knew for sure, though as it turned out, the folks who actually owned it knew exactly where it was. as did some other folks. But the story really didn't get talked about much until the 1890s, when some of the survivors of the voyage, and this is Kosola, known as Kojo Lewis in the United States, who was interviewed and told his story. And with that, interest grew. And finally, in 2017, a crusading environmental reporter by the name of Ben Raines decided he'd like to try to find her. Others had. So Ben went out and took a look and thought that there was a wreck that was on the side that might just be it. And at that point, announced it, and it made global news. The last slave ship has been found. Well, was it or was it not? Sometimes you get the call and you end up being the CSI type of person. And they said, okay, what do you do? And National Geographic called and they said, you're used to dealing with tough things. Why don't you go out and see what you can do? And at that stage, I was brand new to the company. But the beauty of it was that I was brand new to the company as the senior vice president. So, sure, we'll do this for free. Lesson number one, by the way, in corporate life. Don't always offer that. But with it, they were good with this. So we went out, and what we looked at turned out to be a ship built on the west coast of the United States out of Douglas Fir. And these ships came out into the Gulf. They were here. Some of them are actually, they pulled into your port back in the day. They were built to offset losses to German U-boats in World War I. This one's probably the schooner Else that had a motor in her and was laid up and wrecked in the 20s. It was too big to be Clotilda. But with that, we said, look, let's go take a look. Let's see what we can do. The toughest thing in the world is to play the game of pin the name on the shipwreck. So what do? You go out and you systematically, as we say, mow the lawn. Now, I don't have robots to do this. Now, I've got a tiny little flat boat because it's pro bono. We're towing some instruments, and we're looking back and forth, day after day with the whole team. That young lady in the back is the state archaeologist for Alabama, Stacy Hathorne. Alex DeCaro and Kamal Siddiqui and Joe Grenan. We saw a lot of wrecks, but finally this one jumped out. It's like, wow, that looks old, could be, but at this stage, how else to phrase it? Wolf had already been cried. Like, okay, this is it. Oh, no, it's not. So we needed to be very careful. So we went and we looked at every one of those wrecks. Sometimes it's not glamorous. You're diving in dark, muddy water with an alligator nest right across the banks of the river. I'll tell you the best part of it was several years later when we were finishing up the last work on this and we did DNA sampling inside the wreck. Oh, Mama Gator spends a lot of time in there. I just don't want to think about the few times I was in there too. Then there's also the water moccasins, but I digress. So we looked at everything and finally began to do the forensics. There's Stacy and I at the National Archives. We pulled all the original records. The good thing, by the way, is that you gotta love government. We're not, but with that, when the government decided to register or finally get licenses and enrollments for ships, they came up with not only do you have to say it's this type of a vessel, built where and by whom and what's it built of, you also have to register its tonnage. Now the tonnage in those days was calculated by how big it is, how long, how wide, and how deep the hull is. And those basic dimensions are there, 86 feet by 23 feet by 10 feet. But the tonnage is based on an arcane formula that takes all of this and calculates it. And they had that formula down for one reason only. That's the tonnage is how the government taxed you for what you carried. Having learned this secret and how they did it back in the 1860s, when we were all done and we looked at that wreck and I looked at the form of it and whatnot and I ran the numbers, not same length, same width, same depth of hold, and the same tonnage. Pretty good, but what that then meant is we had to say, well, were there any other ships built? Because look, at this stage, what you're looking at is you're looking at a schooner, a typical kind of a Gulf schooner, two-masted, bald-headed, most probably like this. Bald-headed means it doesn't have a big topsail. And probably a little bigger than this one. This is taken in Havana, Cuba in 1860. But that type of a vessel. So basically what you're looking at is you're trying to figure out if a bunch of guys knocked off a bank in a 57 Chevy, and then they decide to ditch it in a back alley, how can you tell one 57 Chevy from another if it doesn't have a license plate on it or a serial number? We had to go back and systematically look at all of this stuff. So the tonnage and the length was there, but we also started, when we dived, recovering things from the wreck in small pieces so that we could do a forensic analysis in the laboratory. The iron, as it turns out, matches the iron ore from Alabama, which was being mined and worked at that stage. It's practically pure iron, but basically ore samples that came from some of the mines in the area match what this is. Plus, this was hand forged by a blacksmith. It's not something cast in more modern times. The other part of it was we also went back and looked at the wood. Clotilda was built of white oak, yellow pine, and the timber samples we had matched. The hull planks were yellow pine. The frames, the ribs, were oak, and so on. So we began to get all of these pieces here and there, but the other piece, which was particularly interesting, is that this vessel had been burned. Captain William Foster said in a late life piece of paper where he wrote down what had happened, said, "I then took my schooner, burned and sank her in 20 feet of water." It didn't hurt, by the way, that at the right tide, this wreck was in 20 feet of water. But you see that piece in the middle, FS-13? See that wood is? That's not worms that have eaten that. That's actually fire damage. And so I looked at that and I went, that's burned. That kind of, that's the way flames come around wood, and they shape it in that way. And then some of the other wood shows alligatoring, and you know what I mean by alligatoring. It's those scales that show up on firewood when you burn something, a log in the fire. How do I know this? I'm the son of a fireman. And Dad ended up being an arson inspector. And so one of my earliest wrecks I was working on was a ship that had burned in 1851. Dad came out to help me. So he always wondered why I didn't want to become a firefighter. I said, I'm more happy being in it than squirting it. But I really honored what he did. And so it was great. The man's still alive, by the way, and so I had him peer review all my work. And he said, no, son, you got that one right, but we also brought in the lead arson inspector for the state, and they all agreed. So here we had the right type of ship, the right size, the right tonnage, the right wood, the right metal. We were pretty close. But we needed a smoking gun. So the smoking gun finally came when we started diving and we went back. I put this rectangle in here for a reason. Up close on this one side, you see a couple of logs up against the bow, the pointy end, as it's known. Back at the end, the stern's been hit and damaged and it's in the mud. But as you move back, just at the very first part of that orange triangle, there's a big wooden bulkhead there. That separates the forecastle, that's where the sailors lived, from the cargo hold. Now, if you move back, you see that it ends there, but then there's another bulkhead past that. That's also big and solid. That's the end of the cargo hold. And we knew the size of it because it fits a formula. And it's like, well, why is this wall here? And then we started, when we dived, we began to see that there was wood that had fallen down, but there were also wooden posts that had risen up. And these wooden posts were built, they're different wood. It was a rough-cut pine. The boards were rough-cut pine. They had been burned a bit, but there were also notches in them that basically, when we looked at them and began feeling them more, because a lot of this diving in the river is effectively, as one wit termed it, the Helen Keller School of Underwater Archaeology. It was the slave ship because it was the platforms that had been built for the people to be transported on. So that was a pretty powerful moment of saying, yes, there it was. And so with that, we were able to announce that it was Clotilda. That made a lot of news. The ship is going to stay in the river. They built a small museum. It brought some closure to some folks who wondered what had happened to it. It closed the book on history, and it ate 6 years of my life. But it was the right kind of thing to do with a wreck like that, with a lot of people interested and some confusion. So when I was at NOAA, we were doing some surveys off the coast of California near the Farallon Islands. They're 26 miles out from San Francisco. It's a rough spot of ocean, as you can see. It not only gets stormy and windy, and something can blow up pretty fast, but these rocks have been fangs that have chewed up a number of ships. We were doing a survey to see how many wrecks were there, because this is all within Greater Farallon's National Marine Sanctuary. And you have a National Marine Sanctuary here in Texas at Flower Garden Banks. So we were looking to inventory. To that end, we went out and we did some survey, but we were also using some data which included this bit of sonar with this wreck showing up. A prominent Bay Area guy whose mother had died had gone out to scatter her ashes in his yacht and never came home. They mounted a long survey for him but could never find him. And so ultimately, after all of that, and his friends, he was a Silicon Valley guy, so they spent a lot of money doing surveys. They turned the data over to NOAA, and with that, we had that data, and we looked at this and said, this is just about 3 miles off southeast Farallon. Let's go check it out. So we did, but I need to also explain one other thing. Southeast Farallon is a seal and sea lion rookery, and the #1 predator for those animals is the great white shark. We didn't dive. And that the wisdom of not diving became very clear when we pulled up to this one and we sent a small little AUV to sort of map first. And the guy said, wait a minute, it just went all the way to the bottom. And then it floated up and it had teeth marks on the side. It still worked, but it was like, okay. Day 2, we come up alongside, and all of a sudden half of a seal comes up in a gush of blood. It's like, okay. So we sent the robot down again. We never dived it. But what we found, and the water is very murky there, so this painting was done to give you a sense of it. We found this sitting on the bottom. And as we moved along bit by bit, feeling our way through with limited visibility, I mean, you could not see from that end of the room to where you're sitting right now. It was that murky. So it's literally, once again, going bit by bit, go through it all. So he said, that's a funny bow. And one guy said, what's that look? I said, that's a tugboat bow. He says, well, that doesn't look like tugboats of today. And I said, it looks an awful lot like the bow of a 1907 tugboat that's at the Maritime Museum in San Francisco. And when I was a young park ranger, I walked by that every morning with a cup of coffee. That's a tugboat bow. That's always the best part of it, by the way, when you're working with other folks in the academic world. And it says, what's your source? Experience. I saw that resonate with a few of you. So we kept moving along, looking at different things. The whole superstructure was gone. Nothing on just the deck. But as we moved back, we could see that it had been a tugboat. There was a winch, and the wire on it had spooled. It's like when you have that fishing rod and it had spooled, come off, the stern was damaged. Spare prop was still there at the back, and said, this wasn't a scuttle. They would have pulled that prop off. That's naval bronze. Nobody leaves that behind. This is a shipwreck. So we kept looking at it and said, well, okay, it's a tug, but whose tug? Where? Did somebody scuttle it? Did it disappear? We weren't quite sure what to do. So we went back, and we attended a conference at the Norfolk Navy Yard. And I'm looking out the window at a bunch of Navy tugs when my colleague Bob Schwimmer, who'd been out on the mission, said, Jim, come up to my room. He said, look what I just found on the internet. He said, is that our tugboat? I said, yeah. Yeah, I said, but how would we know? And he says, well, it's not just any tugboat. This is a tugboat built to haul coal barges that then was taken in by the U.S. Navy and used to escort anti-submarine patrols in World War I off the Azores. And then it went to the West Coast, was repaired at Mare Island Naval Shipyard, and was on its way to Pearl Harbor, towing a barge with sea mines with 56 guys, and it disappeared. Its name was the USS Conestoga. And he said, look at this. He said, it's one of the top 10 unsolved mysteries in the history of the United States Navy. And I went, okay. It left Mare Island. We are 26 miles out at the gate. I said, let's just go back. Let's wind it up. What's the history? He said, well, here's the story. It sailed out. It was supposed to go to Pearl Harbor. It didn't show up. they began asking questions. Okay, it's overdue, it's overdue. What's happened? He said, and then somebody came in and said, wait a minute, I got a radio call a while back, didn't say when, that said some boat, they'd lost their tow and they were heading in. Do you think that could have been them? I said, okay, and the ship, where were you? He said, well, we were off of Hawaii. So the Navy launched the biggest air-sea search in its history to that point. The next time they did it that big, and actually went bigger, was when Amelia Earhart went missing. So here it is in 1921. They're out there with seaplanes, with ships going. They even sent a submarine out, and when the submarine ran out of fuel searching for it, this is the only time in history a United States Navy submarine sailed back to Pearl Harbor because the captain took their canvas cots, sewed them all together, made a sail, attached it to the periscope, and sailed her back to Pearl Harbor. A famous incident in U.S. Navy history. So okay, no such luck. Then somebody says, wait a minute, there's a lifeboat. It's a Navy lifeboat that's floating off of Baja California. Okay, and it has a big C on the bow. All the other letters are gone. So they went down there and scoured a couple others, a few thousand square miles, and it wasn't there. What we were ultimately able to find was that when Conestoga left Mare Island Naval Shipyard, sailed out through the Golden Gate on a calm day, once they got out onto the bar out there, the weather had come up. The lightship that was out there, a floating lighthouse, was experiencing heavy 10 to 12-foot seas. Nobody knew that officially. We had to go pull the lightship logbook and said, okay, so they sailed into heavy seas. And if this is Conestoga, well then if they lost the barge with the mines, that explains it. You don't want to, it's gone. They can't turn around and get it. And with the kind of damage that we see here, the ship is leaking. It has to be leaking. So then with that, then the radio message makes sense. It must have skipped off the atmosphere somehow for the guy to hear it off of Pearl, as opposed to back in San Francisco. But they lost the tow and they were heading in, but they couldn't turn around. Why would they go towards the Farallones? Because there's a lighthouse and there's a U.S. Navy radio station that was not staffed that day, but just the same was there. Then we went back and looked and said, well, it's funny because like a week afterwards, a bunch of supplies washed ashore that were lighthouse service supplies and others, and a life jacket from the Conestoga that washed up on the beach in San Francisco. And nobody thought to ask any questions about that? No, but this woman wrote a letter and actually snipped the name Conestoga out, and the Navy said, no, that can't be. They were heading to Pearl Harbor. So it all began to fit. But what was also important was to realize that the Navy, not knowing what had happened, 60 days out, couldn't find any trace, and so all of these guys were declared lost at sea. What's unfortunate is that the newspapers got a hold of it and the dead were slandered, particularly Ernest Larkin Jones, the commanding officer. He'd come up through the hawsepipe, as we say. He didn't go to the Naval Academy. He learned the hard way. And a couple of admirals infamously in the New York Times said he must not have been up to snuff. Or that maybe the crew were a bunch of malcontents and maybe they'd run off. Maybe they'd gone to sell whiskey, maybe they'd run off to Vladivostok to join the Russians. Who knows? But with that, these families were left. 56 guys gone, and only a stain on their names and no closure. The smoking gun in this case, by the way, when we went back and looked at it, was what we'd passed over, and when we got an ROV that could go in, that's a naval gun of the period. It's like, there's a Navy gun there, and it still has its spotting scope in it. Again, this is not, and it said, well, but is it Conestoga? I said, well, wait a minute. These guys, before they left, did a photo album that they gave to their families. Do we have one? Yes. So with this, I ended up at the Pentagon and sat down with Deputy Secretary, Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and a lot of admirals and captains, and said, here it is. And they went, we agree, you've solved this. And I said, can we turn this over to the casualty office? And they said, Jim, we only go far back as World War II. I said, not a problem. NOAA has a genealogist who works as a volunteer, and she recently helped me track down the descendants when I needed to bury 2 skeletons that came out of the wreck of the USS Monitor that had been sitting on a lab for 10 years in a slab because we couldn't identify them. Just a quick aside on that one. Arlington fought me because they don't bury unknowns anymore, and I got that. The Navy fought me because they didn't do it as well. And I said, well, I can try to force this issue, but no, I got to be clever. Fortunately, my colleague Dave Ahlberg, who's a Navy guy, said, Jim, there's no memorial to all of the guys. 16 guys died when the Monitor sank in 1863. There's a couple of graves here or there for a couple of the guys that are empty cenotaphs at family cemeteries, but there's no monument to them all. I went, perfect. So we came back and I said, Admirals, here's the picture. We don't know exactly who these guys are, but I can guarantee you that if you bury them at Arlington with a monument, I can guarantee you that the right names will be on them. And the director of Arlington said, how can you prove that? I said, well, because we'll put all 16 names on. They'll know their names. And the Assistant Secretary of the Navy turned to all the admirals and said, how come one of you bright boys didn't figure this one out? I said, so there we were. That funeral was the last Civil War burial at Arlington. And we had hundreds of people there, including descendants of Monitor families who lost people on that night when she sank off of Cape Hatteras, but also those who had survived. It was incredible with the caisson rolling down there. Those 2 guys were flown back on an honor flight from Pearl Harbor in caskets. Their skeletal remains there, but on top, modern Navy uniforms. For that. What also helped, by the way, is that to maybe sweeten the deal a little bit more, we did turn to the crime lab at Louisiana State University and said, we've got scans and we've made casts of the skulls. Can you do forensic reconstructions? Yes. So with that, they not only created sculpted, so we could see exactly what these guys looked like. They then had a process where you could basically then, in those days it was a little more camera magic, but suddenly you had what looked like a driver's license or a military ID photo. They weren't skulls anymore, they were people. One an older guy, one a younger guy. And we knew, by the way, from the way those skeletons were found when excavation happened in the turret of the Monitor, 260 feet down off of Cape Hatteras. The younger guy was probably seasick or something. He had a Navy coat thrown over his shoulders, probably cold, sick, maybe thrown up on himself. The older guy was helping him at the moment when the Monitor turned over and that turret fell off. And in that turret, these 2 boys fell 260 feet to the bottom, with the wreck coming down on top of them with tons of coal. One guy still had his wedding ring on that bone. So we humanized them. And how to do that best? Well, we picked a nice day at the National Naval Memorial, brought the Washington Post and a lot of other folks out and released those photos and showed those pictures. And I think the line that really helped a lot, though the Secretary of the Navy later said, that's clever, but ouch, is I said, we may not know who they were, but their mothers would know them. And so with that, those guys got buried. So back to this. We went back to that. They said, this is what we got to do. Those guys are down there. They're probably still in the wreck, but they're buried in that wreck. And the families would probably be fine with that, but I'll go find them. So we took that genealogist who'd worked on the 2 Monitor guys to try to, and what we had her do was try to find people so we could get a DNA match, which we couldn't. So back to this. What I didn't want is for those families to suddenly see on CNN, the USS Conestoga has been found after so many years, and they go, because trust me, some of you may know this well through personal experience. The pain of that loss never goes away for a family. It's remembered, even after a few generations. And so, and we're only talking 1921. So I didn't want them to suddenly wake up and see that story. So we tracked down as many of those families, and I called them. I called each and every one of them from Washington to talk to them about it. It was a mixed bag of responses, for sure, and I'll leave it at that. But a lot of people, some cried, some were angry, it took the government so long. I was honest, I said it was found by a fluke. But in the end, what we did is we organized a reunion for all of those folks, and we had a memorial for them at the National Naval Memorial, and then went out with the Navy. And what you do in a circumstance like that is we no longer throw wreaths into the ocean. What we wanted to do is something a little more special. So what I figured the best thing to do would be was something that we had done off of Galveston a few years earlier, where with a Civil War wreck sunk by the Confederate raider Alabama off of Galveston, the USS Hatteras, 2 guys were still there, buried deep in the wreck. They were 2 Irish engineers. And nothing had ever been done. They were buried at sea. But I decided that we were going to survey this with the Texas Historical Commission and other folks. But I decided that something needed to be done about that because I come from a Catholic family. Those boys weren't buried. They're in purgatory. So I brought a priest out. And we had a Catholic funeral right over the boat on the Noah ship and for those guys. And then we took a big bag of red rose petals and we circled the wreck and draped them in the water along with white rose petals so that the blue of the Gulf and the red and the white were there. So we did the same thing for Conestoga. Another quick aside, I got into a little hot water when I got back to Washington. Somebody said, who authorized a Catholic funeral on a Noah ship? I said, I did. And they said, under what authority? I said, well, the one that saw a lot of that happen with chaplains burying guys in World War II. Oh, okay, we're good. So we did that for the Conestoga guys. Diane is the granddaughter of Ernest Larkin Jones. She lives 20 minutes away from me. When I called and we discovered that, I came to meet with her. We sat down, we talked. There he is. She showed me the only picture she had of her mother with him, and her mother's a newborn baby. I think the most profound moments in a career come with somebody asking a question like this. Did he make a mistake? Did he do wrong? And I said, no, ma'am. Here's what the forensic evidence shows. They were in trouble. It was damaged, and we had this painting done by a friend as a donation for the Navy Memorial. I said, here's what happened. They were in trouble. The ship had probably not been fixed right. They were leaking, and they did the only thing they could do. They knew they couldn't make it back, so every man at his post, brother standing next to brother, raced in Conestoga towards that island. And from the main shipping channel, they got about halfway there, just 3 miles out. She went down with every man at their post. They did their duty to the end. And that was probably one of the more profound moments in my career as a government public servant, but also as an archaeologist who occasionally gets to touch these things and to share these stories. There are so many others, and with that, it is a vast sea full of wrecks and a lot of history and a lot of great museums whose stories remain to be told. Since then, I've been able to work on so many other projects. Most recently, we just came back from diving on the carriers at Midway, 15,000 feet down. That was pretty amazing, in particular because my wife's uncle was a torpedo bomber on the USS Yorktown. So again, so many of us have these connections, and you never know when it happens. The best part of that mission, by the way, was we actually were able, as we were diving both the Japanese carriers, Akagi and Kaga, but also then the Yorktown. Yorktown's pretty intact. You can still see the bomb damage, the fire marks. We dropped the robot into the hold and could see a huge mural they'd painted of their voyages around the world. We also found for the first time aircraft from the battle. We found 2 planes badly damaged in the aft part of the hangar with 1,000-pound bombs still on them. So who are these guys? But the paint survived. They're from the USS Enterprise. They'd just come back, having been shot up, having sunk the Kaga and the Akagi. They were getting refueled and rearmed when a Japanese submarine torpedoed Yorktown, and these guys got off. But there they were. But of all of that, guess what made the world news? When we took another dive into one other part of the hangar, what did we find but a 1941 Woody? A Woody. It's like, okay, that made world news. That made world news. But, and with that, if you do, you can see it online. All of these dives are broadcast live, no paywall, over the internet, if it's a government-funded mission. And in this case, this one was just given service and sacrifice. And I was the lead scientist ashore. So with that, you can see it, and the robot comes up, and there's a voice saying, keep going, keep going. It's good to be the boss. Keep going, keep going. And suddenly, and the guy goes, oh, is that a car? I said, yes. And then another voice comes through, and if you listen to it, you'll recognize it, because what I said was, I can just imagine after the battle, the admiral says, you parked it where? That's who we think whose car it was. Sorry, Frank Jack Fletcher, we found your car. So with that, thank you. Happy to take some questions.
Yes, you mentioned with the Clotilda that they found the log with the captain saying he had burned the ship. Why
Yes.
did he burn it?
Because the ship had been sailing for 40 days with people in that small hold. It had very strong evidence of what had happened, and at that stage, slavery wasn't illegal, but the slave trade was. He faced execution for that crime. He didn't get executed. It's 1860. The tide in the country was turning more towards civil war. So if he burned it, he could basically hide the evidence. And he wasn't trying to completely destroy it. He burned out a section of it and scuttled it right off of the boss's property. One of the things we found, by the way, was owned by Timothy Mayer and his brother, two sea captains who had purchased Clotilda from Foster, who had built it. Is when we were doing our survey, we looked over on the bank, and there's a big concrete property marker that had the Mayer family name on it right off the wreck. So that was another clue, though we didn't know it at the time. But he burned it just to basically, it's like after you've done that bank job, you throw some gas in and you burn the inside of the car out to get rid of some of the evidence. That's what we think. Other questions? Yes?
I'm just curious, you said you descended 15,000 feet. I'm just curious, how does your body feel as far as with nature? What type of feeling does that feel like?
Well, fortunately, when I've been able to do that, I've been inside a submersible. So otherwise, I wouldn't even be talking like this. It would be, so we don't dive to that unless we're in submersibles. In this case, at Midway, we sent a robotic vehicle down. And with that, the robotic vehicle tethered means that we can broadcast it over satellite back so that scientists and folks everywhere can talk and look at it. What we didn't realize when we did that with the Japanese carriers is, you know in downtown Tokyo how they have the huge jumbotrons on the side of the skyscrapers? They were broadcasting the dives with us on the Japanese carriers in downtown Tokyo. That was, I was like, really? That's what's happening right now? Downtown Tokyo is watching us? I was like, yes. Fortunately, we knew how to say the Japanese prayer for the dead in Japanese. The only other time it was sort of a moment like that is we did that off of Pearl Harbor with a Japanese submarine that had been sunk at the start of the Pearl Harbor attack. And we did that for the 75th anniversary. And I was out on the NOAA ship when we were doing this, leading the dive, and we started again with the prayer to the dead in Japanese and talked respectfully about enemies, now friends, allies, all of that. Little did I realize, as I heard later, that the bosses at NOAA told me this. Guess who was watching ashore, watching the whole thing? Barack Obama and the Prime Minister of Japan. I was like, that could have been a career-ending moment if I had done that wrong, but no. So the robotics do it, but the best part of that means is that anybody can tune in and watch them, and all of that's available now. Other questions? Yeah.
It sounded like early in the presentation, there was a Civil War submarine that ended up in Panama?
Yes.
I was just wondering, is that the Alligator?
No, it's not the Alligator. It's called the Submarine Explorer. A guy named Julius Kroll built it after getting yellow fever in the New Orleans campaign and coming home, and decided he'd build a sub that basically he could pressurize to the ambient level of the sea around him, and then he could open hatches on the bottom. He could lay mines, cut anchor chains, but the sub got finished in 1866. The Navy didn't want to buy it. So instead, Tiffany and a bunch of other guys purchased it and sent it down to Panama to harvest pearls. The problem is that when you go down to about 100 feet and you stay down there for all day and you're pressurized at the same level, and if you're a diver, guess what happened to these guys? They got narcosis, and it hurt. So anyway, when we first went out there and looked at that sub, all the locals, the descendants of the pearl fishers are still there, and I said, "What about this?" They go, "It's a ship of death. Don't go in there, senor, because anybody who goes in there dies." So that's what it was. So anyway, Julius Kroll's Submarine Explorer. We documented it carefully. We were able to recreate its plans. It's an amazing piece of American ingenuity built by this guy. And it's slowly rusting in peace now off of Isla San Telmo in the Bay of Panama. But its drawings that we just did with support from some colleagues are in the Library of Congress and Historic American Engineering record. Yes, you had a question.
Off the coast of Texas, what have you investigated? What's the most unique?
The most interesting one off the coast of Texas. Well, we've looked at a few of them. We've looked at World War II ships that have been sunk. We looked at the Hatteras, which was sunk, of course, by the Alabama off of Galveston. But the most interesting one is in 2013. As you know, the Gulf is constantly being surveyed for oil and gas. And these guys out there, they're in the Monterey Block, which is roughly 200 miles out. It was 199 miles out, actually, from Galveston. They came across some shipwrecks, at least looked like shipwrecks in the sonar. So they reported it to the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and BOEM said, "Okay, that's cool." NOAA was going to go out and do some more surveys and said, "When we're out there, is there anything you want us to look at?" They said, "Go look at these wrecks." So when we looked at these wrecks, what they turned out to be were early 19th century sailing vessels, and we saw 3 of them. The one that's most interesting, and they called them the Monterey wrecks, Monterey A. And we documented them first, and then we went back with Bob Ballard and team with funding from a group of really proud Texans. Because the thought was maybe, because this was a schooner, it was a 2-masted schooner that was armed, it was a warship, and the thought was, is this the Texas Navy's San Antonio that went missing? That'd sure make a certain number of Texans happy. Just for the record, I mean, my office was at College Station. When I was president of the Institute of Nautical Archaeology, just saying. On my board, I had the former director of Parks and some other real prominent Houstonians and others. So it's like, okay, let's see what we can do. So private money did that. So we went back out with Bob. And what we found is actually it's early. Dates probably to about 1817, and it is likely a privateer or a pirate. And 2 ships alongside it, one of which is a small Mexican trader with stacks of hides and big blocks of what's probably lacquer and wooden boxes of some unknown origin and cattle horn and big bottles of tequila. Probably a prize along with another bigger ship. So we think these guys were in a convoy, and we think they sank in 1818 with a big hurricane that went through the Gulf at that time. One of the theories is that it's one of the Confederates of Jean Lafitte named Louis Henri, who had a flotilla heading from the coast of Mexico to Galveston. And these wrecks are more or less in a straight line for Galveston, or if you look away, they're in a straight line to New Orleans. Or the point is, that's what we thought. It was an amazing sight. Again, with Bob, we did it with robotic vehicles. We did a little excavation. We raised a few artifacts, which were conserved and are at the Bullock Museum now. And the book is just about finished now that my colleagues have been working on. That was one of the most amazing ones for me, just working, in and around Texas waters.
There's going to be a book on that.
Yes, there is, Texas A&M University Press. I do a lot of publishing with the Ags, just saying. Yes, sir.
I'm interested with the Titanic thing, with the Ocean Gate tragedy. Is this something with your long career? You know the dangers of this thing. With the increasing desire to like commercialize these things, is this something that you're concerned about, or is it?
I'm not so concerned. What happened there was, if I'm sure you all know the story. Some of you have probably seen the documentary. I knew Stockton Rush very well. I knew P.H. Nargeolet very well. That should not have happened. The risks were very apparent. It was hubris. There was a cover-up of sorts, as we know. I had one of my guys from NOAA go check that sub out, and he said it was a death trap. And Stockton lied to him about some things. So, no. No, I'm less concerned about that. I think tourism's okay. I think that going in submersibles is okay. Today we're using the robotic vehicles, and I like that because I can then share it with all of you, particularly with some of these other missions without a paywall. But no, that just shouldn't have happened. When I've been in a little bit more of a state of irk, I've actually used the word murder. Yes?
It's my understanding that with time, the rust and deterioration of Titanic will lead to just having a rust stain on the floor
Yeah,
of the sea.
that's true.
Sometime, maybe in the next 20 to 40 years or something like that.
50 to 80, probably,
Just
in the ballpark, yeah.
Nothing other than just a stain on the floor.
Well, no, what'll happen in 50 to 80 years is all the superstructure will be gone. That hull is this thick. And those guys, I mean, right now, Titanic's hull, with all the stuff that's bled down on it, it looks worse than it is. The spots where it's actually coming out, it's basically, Titanic has a real bad case of teenage acne. Is what it really is with the hull itself. Everything else is going to pieces. In the time between I dived it in 2000 to 2010, I saw change, but that was up top, more so with that lighter steel. And people have gone bump a few times with some of the subs. The Russians did. We got stuck under the stern for the longest 20 minutes of my life. So, but again, no problem. We did get out, and my mother, rest her soul, said later, I do not recall signing a permission slip. But so, yeah, I think, no, Titanic's going to be around for a while, but it won't look, and it's already changed. So when you see the stories, it's falling apart. It's the old house that starts to lose the roof, and the windows blow out, and some of the siding comes off, but the frames are still there, and the foundation's solid. Yes?
How did you originally get into this? Because this is such a beautiful thing and so many accomplishments. How did you travel down this path?
I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, in what now is Silicon Valley, but back then was orchards and ranches. Yes, I mean, you could tell great-grandma came from Waco. So yes, I rode a horse before I ever drove a car. I learned to rope and brand and geld. Oh yeah, yeehaw. But with that area began to change dramatically. And I fell in love, thanks in 6th grade, with archaeology in Egypt and Rome and Greece. And then close to us, they bulldozed a 2,000-year-old prehistoric site and with over 3,000 burials. And nobody wanted to do anything about it, so I took it upon myself to go rescue as many of them as I could. So my poor mother, for the next 2 years, had to put up with me coming home each day with a new dead friend. I saved about 200 of those burials, processed them, reassembled them, particularly where they'd been bulldozed, and then tracked down the descendants of that tribe, and they were reburied. That's what got me started. And then in San Francisco in 1978, as a young National Park Service historian, they struck a ship buried next to the Transamerica Pyramid 20 feet down below the sidewalk that had come in 1849, pulled ashore and turned into a warehouse, had burned and been filled over. San Francisco's waterfront today is 10 blocks away from where the beach once was, which is where the Transamerica Pyramid is. So there's lots of ships that are buried there, and that just changed my life. I thought that was the coolest thing ever. particularly as when we excavated it, a guy had taken his leather jacket off, probably on that afternoon of May 4th, 1851, when it was all burning, and that jacket was still there, next to canisters of pâté and bottles of French champagne, which for the record tasted terrible. The whiskey was another thing.